you look at early philosophers and scientists, like before we really knew a lot about what goes on in the brain, they talk about the heart, right? They thought the brain was useless material, and they thought that the heart was actually the seat of the soul. The feelings were in your chest, so they gave that as the locus.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to The Wonder and the Mystery of Being. This is episode 23, and it's called Do We Have a Soul? My guest today is Shannon Q, and I'll let her introduce herself when we get into the conversation. But Shannon is someone who I've met online, as so many of us have done during these COVID times. You know, making new friends online is something that has been really fun for me and hopefully for all of you as well, as we've been sort of less able to engage with people physically than we're used to over the past year. And Shannon is one of several sort of atheist YouTubers who have reached out to me and been very kind to me over the past year. And people with, whom I've developed some really great friendships. If you follow my show, you may remember I had Paulogia on my show a few months ago. He's another example of sort of an atheist activist on YouTube who has been very kind and engaging with me. And I've really been enjoying getting to know Shannon and a number of other YouTubers with a variety of different perspectives. Shannon's perspective I thought was really interesting because she brings such a strong psychological perspective to a lot of the topics that she talks about and that I touch on this show. So I wanted to talk to her specifically about the soul. Now, the idea that we all have a soul is, for me, an idea that just sort of felt like a basic fact growing up. But as I studied, I came to the realization that that's actually sort of a contentious point. And depending on your background, your upbringing, and the sort of way that you see the world, you may or may not believe in the idea of a soul. Or maybe your belief in the idea of a soul might look different than someone else's. It seems to me that the idea of a soul is somewhat required for heaven and hell to have any real meaning. So it's a required component of, I would say it's a required component of most religious and spiritual beliefs that have some sort of an afterlife associated with them. So it does seem to me that the conversation about whether or not we have a soul is very difficult to separate from our conversations about religion and spirituality because it's so consequential. So in this conversation, Shannon and I start out talking about brain and mind and soul and what the differences are between those three ideas. And then we go on a number of pretty incredible tangents. Now, if you've watched my show before, you know that I have a tendency to go off on tangents whenever I find a shiny thing that appears interesting to me. And Shannon has that same tendency. So we sort of, in the back half of the conversation, we let that all hang out and we got into some really, really strange and amazing and cool ideas. I hope you enjoy that sort of real loose conversation. The front half of the conversation is a little bit more directed. The back half is a free-for-all. So I'm really, really grateful to Shannon for having this conversation with me, and I'm not going to waste any more of your time talking to you here, so please enjoy my conversation with Shannon Q. Like, just to kind of get started, like, just so for people that aren't familiar with who you are, who are you and what do you do?
Well, that's a loaded question. My name is Shannon.
It's fully loaded. Yeah.
It's very loaded.
Yeah.
I do lots of things. My name is Shannon Q. For the purposes of this podcast, I suppose.
That's fair. That's fair.
I'm an atheist advocate. I am somebody who has a background in psychology. I have a degree in psychology and got intensely frustrated on two fronts. One, that the quality of conversations that were taking place were a bit more toxic and combative and less conciliatory and explorational. So I wanted to start having those types of conversations. And two, was frustrated with the consistent misrepresentation of my field in apologetics and even in counter apologetics. People tend to misuse psychology because they see it as something intuitive. So I started to kind of enter the public foray with regards to counter apologetics and discussing religion and religious belief and religious practice and the effects of religion with people on the internet. So I host a show called The Atheist Experience, and I host a show called The Line, and I have my own channel called Shannon Q that you came and had we had a great conversation.
Yeah, that was a blast.
It was.
And you do all kinds of stuff live, so it's sort of like you just do not know what's going to happen in a live broadcast.
It's gone off the rails a few times.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, that's a great primer. I've noticed in everything that you do bring that psychology perspective to the table pretty regularly, and that's one of the things I love about your approach. Is every time I've watched anything that you've been a part of or had to engage with you on any level, I always come away thinking about some new aspects of the brain and the mind, and and are those two things the same or different? And actually, maybe that's a relevant place to start. How should I think what we could really cover today is brain, mind, and soul.
Oh, it's my favorite thing. I'm all in. Let's go. That'll take hours.
What are these three things? Yeah. What are these three things? Are they discrete things? Are we in popular imagination of what these three things are? Are we on the money, or do we have some misconceptions that are really common? So I know that's painting the broadest of strokes here, but what do you think people believe about these things that, I'm starting too specific. Let's go back. Okay. Brain, mind, and soul. Do you think that these are three discrete things that exist in some way, or do you think that we're muddying the waters too much when we talk about them as separate things?
That's a good question. So I think the soul isn't a thing in any way it's ever been defined to me. It seems at best to be synonymous with conceptualizations of the mind. Okay. And at worst to be incompatible with anything that I know about neuroscience at all.
Let me ask specifically about the soul before we keep going.
Yeah.
Do you think, so you don't believe that there's such a thing as a literal soul,
Correct.
But there is some sort of conception of the thing that makes you, and maybe we can get into what that is.
Why couldn't that be the mind then?
Well, maybe that's the mind. So maybe tell me about the mind.
Okay, so this is such a broad subject.
Yeah, I know. I'm intimidated by that.
I kind of want to finish answering your first question.
I'm sorry.
First.
See, I interrupted you. Finish answering
No, you're
my
totally
first question.
fine. You're totally. It's an exciting thing to discuss. I don't blame you. I do the same thing. Quite frankly, you and I have had conversations that have gone down many a rabbit trail because they're interesting.
Yeah, and every episode I get someone who says, "John, stop talking," and I'm like, "I know, I agree."
Never stop talking. I love listening to you talk. You're a wonderful person.
Oh, thank you. Well, please pick up where I rudely interrupted you. Yeah.
So when it comes to the soul, the mind, and the brain, and so I've already established that I don't really think the soul is a thing. I think it's kind of an unnecessary sort of ancillary thing that's inserted into the conversations about the mind and the body. Now, when it comes to the brain and the mind, I feel as though the mind is an emergent property of the brain, and we can get into the minutia of that later. So the brain is like a physical thing. It's tangible. You can literally pick it up. It's a tangible physical object, right?
Right.
Whereas the mind is something that isn't something that you can pick up. It exists in a different sort of way conceptually than something that has demonstrable physical properties. And that's where the mind-body problem comes in, which is why is it that there is something that it's like to be any sort of configuration of matter, right? Like if you read David Chalmers, that is a real thing. It's an interesting question, and it's a question we're kind of chipping away at, and I can kind of address some of the things that I think are interesting pieces of information that are starting to kind of chip away at that problem a little bit.
For people who are trying to conceptualize the problem, like in the most simple terms, the mind-body problem is
why is there a specific property to brain matter that like what's in your head, your brain, that there is something that it is like to be that, whereas my glasses that I keep fiddling with, I wouldn't say that there is something that it's like to be my glasses, but my glasses are also matter, right?
Right. So it's sort of like we have this brain. This brain is processing information, but the experience of being conscious feels like more than just the processing of information. There's a me in here.
Yes. Right.
And why is that me here exactly and not elsewhere? Is that sort of a formulation of the mind-body problem?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair summation. Or why does it exist at all is also a fair way.
Yeah,
of
why is there a
why
me?
is it right? Yeah, right. Exactly. So that's to answer your first question, and then I rudely interrupted you, and I forgot your second question.
Perfect. No, I was getting to with soul. Okay, so the reason why the rabbit trail my brain was going down. Or my mind was going down, which I don't know which one was going down. Maybe they both were hand in hand, dancing down this tangent. But where I was going was that. So, like, if I was to describe Jess, my partner, if I was to describe her to you, I would describe a bunch of things about her. I'd be describing her personality and the way she goes through life and all this stuff. And what I'd be doing when I'm doing that is I'm trying to abstract out what it is that Jess is. And I know I'm doing it from my perspective, but I'm trying to almost like abstract out her essence. Like, what is the essence of Jess, right? Okay. And like, I could see someone saying like, whatever that essence is, that thing that makes her, like in some at least metaphorical way, that's like your soul, right?
Why though?
No, I know, and so I know I'm poking around, and I'm talking about something metaphorically, and you're like, why? But that's I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, why did we ever conceptualize the idea of a soul in the first place? Because
for starters, we didn't have a clear or concise, and we still don't to a certain degree, understanding of neuroscience, right? And what actually goes on in your brain. Like if you look back in time, most scientists, like if you look at early philosophers and scientists, like before we really knew a lot about what goes on in the mind, like in the brain. I'm going to try not to use them as synonyms for the sake of conversation.
I do that all the time just because I just don't know what I'm talking about.
But they talk about the heart, right?
Because that's a metaphor too.
But it wasn't always perceived as a metaphor, right? They thought the brain was useless material, and they thought that the heart was actually the seat of the soul, because that's where they had the feelings. They felt as though that like the feelings were in your chest, so the heart was actually where they affiliated that. They gave that as the locus for that reason, because that's where they were centralized and focused with regards to their feelings regarding this, because they felt it physically.
Right.
Scientists.
No, that actually makes sense, because I'm thinking about I love the air quotes, scientist.
Yeah. Well, yeah, before science existed for the most part.
Right. It makes sense because like when you feel something deeply, like say like something really bad happens and you're witnessing it, you're the pit of you have this feeling like in the pit of your stomach, like it just drops. And I could see why people are like, oh, everything you're feeling, your sensations, like you said, the locus of all of that is like right here in your chest. I could see why people felt that way, but then we learned more.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of that is to say that I think that we as humans really there is something that it is like to be us, and that's important. And we recognize that it's something that it's like to be other people as well, because they're like us. And we perceive ourselves as valuable and important and want to perceive others as valuable and important and in some degree immutable, which we can get into because I don't think that's the case. And because of that, we want to sort of, and we want those relationships to last forever too, to a certain degree. We want people that we love and ourselves to exist in some fashion exterior of this life. So we start to develop concepts like the soul in order to emotionally reconcile that and then become very, very attached to them, which makes sense. Like psychologically, that makes some sense.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's tenable.
Do you think, so you think then, and I would probably tend to agree with you that the whole idea of a soul, it's like, well, that was necessary in order to believe that something about you carries on after death.
Sure.
And so it's almost like it was a prerequisite for those beliefs that people were using to comfort themselves when they were confronted with their own mortality.
I'd say that's fair.
Yeah.
And I'd say it was almost to a certain degree natural, lacking other information to the contrary, to create this sort of construct that this was a real, actual thing that we need to hold on to. Like with no evidence to the contrary, if we didn't know anything about what brains did, if we just thought that brains were just something in, like just a mush of meat in your head and knew nothing else about them, right? Like all we know is that people exist and they die, and it's something that it's like to be us, and that there's something that it's like to be them, and that's valuable to us, and we know nothing else, and we feel all of these feelings about it. It would be reasonable to sort of construct this conceptualization that is something ethereal, that is something that's non-corporeal, that is something that we can't explain using our physical bodies. So we create something different to explain it, and that's emotionally satisfying, so it consistently propagates.
Yeah. When I've done a little bit of, like, as I've been studying the Bible specifically, I've thought about this idea of the soul a little bit because it's relevant, because the way that the ancient Hebrews wrote about themselves and, individuals and their culture, the way that they wrote seems to indicate that they didn't necessarily believe in a soul that was sort of separate from the body. But there was a sense of that belief in Greek culture. And so as that sort of Hellenized the sort of Jewish culture over time, you start to see these ideas pop up. And then obviously in the New Testament, which was written in Greek by people that were very likely Greek educated, then you start to see a real emphasis in like eternity in some place.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, that was my trajectory and how I even got thinking about the soul at all. Because I was studying the various ways that it's written about in the Bible.
Right.
And so it seems to me that like Plato was a pretty critical figure, at least it seems like, in my limited understanding, that there's I think a term called Platonic Dualism. Is that right?
Probably. I'm no philosopher. I love engaging with them, but I will not pretend to be one. So probably.
Right. So I think that was the idea that there is a soul separate from the body. And that idea sort of got injected into Christianity, and then off we went. And before you know it, we have, Revelation, and we have, people talking about heaven and hell, and that becoming like the focus of Christianity. Where are you going to spend eternity? These are the billboards you see, So in psychology, though, like, I would imagine most people approaching this subject from a more psychological point of view, I mean, is there a sense of like irritation when you start talking about the soul? Because it's like I could see it feeling like not helpful.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
Okay, so I can tell you a great deal about that. One of the things that frustrates me is this incessant need to inject the soul into any interpretation of anything related to the study of the brain or the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so constraining, right? Like if you're going into research like something that's happening in your brain or some sort of psychological outcome, and you're consistently needing to reference that to the soul or tether it somehow to whatever your individual conceptualization of the soul is, because there are many.
Right.
There are many. Whatever your individual conceptualization is, then that's the lens through which you're going to view any of this information through, which results, I think, in a lot of people ignoring huge swaths of information. And it's frustrating. Really, really frustrating to me, to the point that I did it myself. When I was a Christian, I totally did it myself. When I entered into university to start studying psychology and cognition, because I'm not the like lay on the couch, let's talk about your feelings type of psychologist. Yeah. I studied perceptual cognition and communication theory. So I studied like the brain and how you perceive things,
right,
more so than I studied, I'm not the therapeutic perspective. I know some people. I always like to clarify that because I think some people hear psychologist and they think therapist. They think that
and they think, hey, can I tell you about some of my problems and you can tell me what I should do about them? Yeah.
I'm not the best person to have that discussion with. You should seek a professional. But when I was studying it, a lot of things I was able to reconcile. I've often used the analogy that you can only fit so many things into a box before you have to stop taking new things in or break that box.
Right.
And I had to break the box. Like when I got to sodium ion action potential generation in neurons, I realized that the soul didn't make sense.
All right. Well, then you're going to have to tell me about that now.
Oh, okay.
Yes, please
sure.
tell me about that. Because I don't know what that is.
If you get me talking about brains, we'll never leave.
Well, that's great. That's why we're here.
Okay, good. So you have neurons in your brain, right? The neurons are like the little microscopic bits of your brain that actually transmit neurotransmitters, which equate to, you having a thought, or you making a movement. None of that happens without a neuron firing and a neurotransmitter being emitted in order to be received by another neuron all the way along down the line, right?
Right.
Now, how do you think those neurons fire? What makes those neurons fire?
I have no idea.
Okay. Nobody does, really. Well, people do. I do. So I found out. And when I found out, I was like, okay, there's no room for this. What makes them fire is neurons are basically like any other cell. So they have a mitochondria inside them, right?
That I am familiar with a little bit.
Right. So like they're constructed in the same way as any other cell in your body for the most part, except for they have dendrites and axons. Like they're a little bit more complex, but that has to do with the fact that they transmit information. But the actual construction of the cell itself, where the action potential forms, and an action potential is essentially just creating energy, like a mental electricity.
So it's like a little burst of electricity.
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. Yes, that's a good way of describing it. So in order for that to take place, a mitochondria in your cell needs to produce a chemical called ATP. Now that chemical, that ATP chemical, needs to open a channel in the membrane of that neuron cell, and the configuration of sodium and potassium ions on either side of that cell needs to be such that there's a differentiation that causes that cell to require equilibrium. And when that ATP opens the channel, then the sodium and potassium ions travel across that channel until they reach a specific configuration. And at that point, when they reach that specific configuration, that neuron hits their action potential ratio and the neuron fires.
That's now complicated.
Not really. Like
Sounds complicated. So
it's not that it's a little complicated,
right.
But essentially what it means and what did it for me when I realized that was if I think that my soul, like we all, even an apologist will admit your brain does a thing, right? Like it does some kind of thing. Like we've talked about Phineas Gage before.
Yeah, and
They'll
we
admit
are going to talk about Phineas Gage because it's epic, this story.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. That's another one that was like a chink in the armor for sure. But this one was like the nail in the coffin for me. When I realized that in order for me to have any thought in my head, in order for me to make any sort of movement in my body, in order for me to even have the deliberation about whether or not I had a soul, this needed to happen. And this was a very physical process. So it's very physical. Like at what point would my soul would have to come in with little sodium potassium ion tweezers and put them in the correct configuration on either side of my neuronal cell membrane and then squeeze my mitochondria to get the ATP to come out to open the channel in order for that specific configuration to reach a diffusion ratio to travel across the membrane of that neuron so that that neuron could fire to even start having the thought about this conversation. I just realized like there's no room for that in there. And also it's unnecessary.
Right,
it's
I see what you're saying.
Necessary.
So
I would be pushing a soul in there where no soul is needed, and doing some crazy ass mental gymnastics to try to make it make sense.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. I totally get it.
Okay.
Let me give an analogy, and it's just so we can make sure that I understand. I like doing this sometimes when I think I understand, because sometimes I discover that I didn't. But like it's like so. What I'm hearing is it's kind of like if you see cars driving down the street and you've never seen an engine before in your life, and you're like, there's some sort of, and maybe you have a car, and you've never looked under the hood, but you just assume like there's some sort of magic, there's a magical being, a magical thing under the hood that makes this car go, and then you open the hood. And when you spend time learning about the engine and all the constituent elements of the engine, you realize it's a completely physical process. Every component in the engine, it makes sense that it's there, and no magic is needed once you understand the components. Is that like somewhat like what you're talking about?
Yeah, that fits very, very well. And also, not only is there no magic needed, I don't know where it would fit.
Oh, it's like there's no space for the magic.
Right, because I mean, you would have to do this to a person who's actually still alive, but to see, you would need to have this rapid fire, constant movement based on what your soul wants in order for it to enact upon your body, in order for it to act upon your brain to do this. There would constantly be this slurry of sodium and potassium ions just basically popping into and out of existence in your brain all day, every day. And I feel like that would look like a thing on an MRI.
Right.
It would look like a thing. And we just don't.
But everything that happens, so you're saying like everything that we can see happening in the brain, these things, these processes happening, they're not only are they enough to explain what happens in the brain, but there's not a lot of room for anything else other than those explanations.
There isn't for me. Yeah. I'm open to hearing people give me explanations as to why there is that aren't very strictly, hypothetical and philosophical in nature.
Yeah. I do notice in philosophy, there's a lot more of an openness to the idea of a soul from some people. I don't tend to be in that camp, but usually we should say it's usually philosophers who are of the religious variety.
Yeah.
So, okay, so Phineas Gage, we mentioned a minute ago, and this is the one that did it for me.
Oh, really?
Well,
interesting.
Yeah,
you did
because
it in your soul, eh?
Yeah, this is the one that did it for me. So, So I'll briefly tell the story of Phineas Gage and jump in anytime you think I've gotten something wrong, because it could happen.
I'm super familiar with Phineas Gage.
Okay, you know the story. Well, why don't you tell the story then? Because I've heard tell it.
It's your story.
It's not my story. It's Phineas Gage's story.
Well, you said he did it for you.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Okay, so I'll tell it. I'll be brief, and maybe we can bounce it around a little bit.
Sure.
My understanding is Phineas Gage was an iron worker. Is that right?
Railroad
worker. See, already wrong. So
he had a dampening rod that there was an explosive.
So he had a pretty horrible accident where this rod went all the way through his head and like right into his brain. And it
went through his cheekbone, through his frontal lobe.
Yeah, and I'm not going to put
straight through.
Yeah, I'm not going to put images of it here. Yeah. But if you want to find them, they're out there. Mm-hmm. It's a little disturbing, just a warning. But he not only did he survive. I mean, I'm trying to remember. Was he conscious, like with the rod in his head?
The rod shot straight through his head.
Oh, it didn't
stay
stick
in his head. He was dampening down an explosive.
Yeah.
And the explosive went off while he was dampening it down. And he was holding it in his hand like this. And when he shot it down, it went through his hands with such force that the rod shot underneath his cheekbone and then out the top of his head on the other side through his optic nerve. And it just shot straight through. But on its way through, it took out a good chunk of his prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex is one of the more newly evolved parts of our brain, right?
That's fair to say. Yeah.
And I think from what I understand, there's a significant amount of the stuff that makes you going on in the prefrontal cortex, right?
It's where a lot of your reasoning takes place. On the bottom part of the prefrontal cortex, there's I'm going to forget it right now. I think it's this. I'm going to forget the exact name of it. But on the bottom part of the prefrontal cortex is where your midbrain, which is a super important part of your brain. You lose your midbrain, you're pretty much toast.
You're done. Yeah.
Like you can lose a good chunk of your cortices and be fine. You can mess with the cortices a bit. Well, not fine, but like survive. Your mid and hind brain are pretty much toast if you lose that. But the bottom part of your prefrontal cortex, I'm not going to remember it right now, and I'm so sorry that I'm not. There's a connection basically between your midbrain and your prefrontal cortex that. So how's the best way to describe this? Your prefrontal cortex is kind of like the logical side of your brain. It's what looks at things rationally. Yeah. But because we aren't solely rational beings.
Certainly not.
Things that we look at rationally have a connection to emotional experience. So if you lose the part of your prefrontal cortex that connects your rationality to your emotionality, then you're going to stop having as much empathy, for example, towards things. You're going to act more viscerally, and you're going to possibly give in more to baser, sort of somewhat selfish, indulgent instincts.
Yes. And this is relevant for Phineas Gage because what happened with Phineas Gage is he survived this horrific trauma, but he was never the same again. He became very emotional. He had a hard time controlling his emotions. He became a lot more aggressive. I can't remember if he had substance abuse issues.
He became an alcoholic.
Yeah. And so the thing, reading about Phineas Gage, and obviously I have a fragmented memory of this story, clearly, but the thing that really stuck with me is that damage to his brain changed everything about him as far as like who he was, right? Because like what makes you you? What makes you is complicated, but for other people, it's basically the way that they interact with you, right? The way you interact with them, and if that completely changes based on a physical injury, that indicates that whatever makes you you is seated in the nervous system, and it's an, like you said, it's an emergent property of a physical thing.
What was really fascinating about Phineas Gage too is that he perceived no discontinuity of self.
Oh.
So that's one of the things that's really interesting about him. Like from a psychological perspective, he didn't feel as though I was Phineas Gage this way and now I'm Phineas Gage this way.
He didn't feel like he had changed.
No, not at all, really. No, his perception of self was still such that he was like, I'm still me, right? I'm still me. Like, what's your problem? This is who I am.
Right.
He didn't see a discontinuity. He didn't, like, other people would tell him that there's a discontinuity, and he would sometimes get frustrated about it, or he would say, people change over time. He would find rationalizations to explain away the discontinuity, like everybody changes, things like that. But he himself didn't see that, I was this guy and now I'm this guy. Even though outwardly, this was what was really, really striking and why his story is so important. Because outwardly, he very clearly was this intensely docile person prior. He was somebody who was very mild-mannered and pious even, and went from that to having almost no regulatory control over his executive function when it came to impulse control, and was, just really dismissive and combative with people and violent, and had a substance abuse problem and had low impulse control, like all of these things that people would not have ever affiliated with his past self. But he was still Phineas Gage. Like, he still had memories of being of his life prior. He still knew who the people he was in relationships with were. He just had his personality just flipped.
Yeah.
Which is what's so crazy. It draws into stark context that you can have a brain event that fundamentally changes who you are. Like, we're that vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was the first person to just bring that to the forefront.
Yeah. And that's
super important case.
That was a situation that I found sort of challenged the idea of the soul for me, right at the moment where I was contemplating heaven and hell. So
oh wow.
In my sort of process, I sort of, people that watch the show know I sort of went through a process we call deconstruction, air quotes. But for me, it wasn't like a single moment. It was I spent a few months thinking really deeply about heaven and hell, and then a few months thinking really deeply about evolution, and then a long time thinking about the Bible. And I'm still in that one. Because that one just keeps being more. Oh,
that one's got layers upon layers.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can spend a lifetime.
Yeah. And people do. Certainly.
And it's fascinating. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah. So I read the story of Phineas Gage right as I was thinking about heaven and hell. And the reason why it was so critical for me is I was if everything about you, if you, the you that exists, the thing that makes you, if that is inextricable from your body, if that is, it's rooted in your body, and once your body dies, that thing ceases to be, then heaven and hell is just irrelevant. And that was why the Phineas Gage thing was so big for me, because it was a piece of information that indicated to me, okay, the things that make me really are rooted in this body, and doing something to this body can change the things that make me.
Right.
And
so how do you, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, please, what were you going to say?
So I'm excited to talk about this a little bit more, because what do you say to people? Because this is something that I encounter a lot, that, it was still him and he still had a soul, and that his soul just kind of changed with him. Because I have a problem with that based on the conceptualizations of the soul that I've encountered. Because you're essentially, especially when you combine them with doctrine and free will and all of this stuff and original sin and all of that stuff, when it's imbued with all of that stuff.
Yeah.
That,
a lot of that stuff I don't believe in either.
Well, yeah, I don't believe in any of it, but...
Including, I'm dubious about free will too. So,
Ooh.
Oh,
I did not know that. Interesting. But like when you imbue it with all of that stuff, because this is what, back to discontinuity, because what bothered me is that you're essentially, especially in Christian doctrine, they're saying you're responsible for your own actions. You have to make these choices in order for salvation to be yours, right?
Right.
But we have a demonstration where somebody, and that you're a soul, not a body, and your body just kind of acts through your soul. Like those are all sort of intrinsic, immutable parts of that doctrine.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But we have somebody here, and also cases of demyelination events like dementia, for example,
right,
where like these really well laid out cases where even if you see the soul as something real that's interacting with the body, what happens to the soul when it can no longer interact with the body? Can the body then make different choices?
That's an interesting question.
That's one of the things that did it for me too. Because if you're saying, well, you are your soul, and your soul uses your brain to move the body and do stuff, but ultimately you're your soul. But then we can say, okay, well, what if I lobotomize you?
Yeah.
If I lobotomize you, you're still alive. You could make some horrible choices. You could. What if I do something to you that gives you a psychotic event?
At what point are you no longer responsible for your actions?
Right.
Yeah.
And also, where does your soul factor into that? Is that your body doing something your soul had no part in? Where does your salvation lie then?
Good question.
Or are you saying that if I make a change to my body that affects my behavior, that change is simultaneously happening to my soul? And then at that point, why do you even need it?
Right.
You're like, why do you need it? That's dumb.
Here's a question. Here's a question. So
okay.
I've literally, I just thought of this as you were talking. I've never had this thought before.
Okay.
As it relates to the soul. So if we're talking about the responsibility of a person to, like within the Christian faith, if we're talking about the responsibility of a person to make a decision for Christ, say, and I'm dubious about it being a decision because I don't know how you can decide to be persuaded of something. But that's
free will.
That's back on the free will thing. So that's a deviation. We'll stay away from that. But so let's just accept for a second that a decision needs to be made for Jesus in this dynamic, in this paradigm.
Right. Yeah.
Whenever you bring up children, it's understood that like, well, children aren't yet responsible for that decision, right? Because it's like, well, they're kids. They're not adults. They can't make a decision yet. Like, and they can't be held responsible for making that decision yet because they're not mature. So my question then is like, well, hold up. So we're saying that they can't make a decision because their brains aren't fully developed, right?
Yes.
But if you believe in a soul, you believe that they have a soul.
And that's eternal.
But their brains are not fully developed. And it's based on the lack of development in the brain that they're off the hook on the decision.
Right. And simultaneously, too, like that made me think of, are we saying that souls start not being culpable? Like, at what point does a soul start being culpable
This is what
for
I'm getting
its
at.
actions?
Yeah.
Right?
So I'm realizing
because you're acknowledging that at a point in time, a child clearly can't be culpable for making poor decisions because they're not equipped yet, because cognitively they're not developed enough physically to do it.
Right. And if you just maintain a physicalist or a materialist perspective here, then all of that makes sense. So you're just like, well, yeah, they were born, their brains are not developed, so they're not able to make they're not able to understand things as easily. They're not able to make choices like an adult could because they're just not mature. They're not, they haven't developed to that standard yet.
Right.
I feel like we're talking about the car again because it's like, where does the soul fit into that?
I don't think it's very difficult to pack it in. It really is, because once you start to really scrutinize it, I find that it's one of the things that falls apart the most quickly for me.
That's what I'm feeling right now.
Right? It really, even trying to find justifications for it, like to steel man the arguments for it, I find very, very difficult because it's so hard. Because have you... I'm going to sidetrack. I'm bad at this. I'm trying to be better on your channel than I am on my channel.
No, I love it. I did an interview this week where I tried to stay really on track on what we were talking about.
Right.
It was with a professor at Yale who's very smart, and we got
Joel?
to the what's that? Oh yeah, Joel. Yeah,
I love him.
Yeah, Dr. Baden. So
Yeah.
I got to the end and I was like, I think we did okay at staying on track. And at the end, he was like, you seem like you're interested in having a more like over here and over there conversation. And I was like, yeah, that's my home base. and he was like, well, I would love to do one of those. So maybe let's do another one. And I was like, oh, well, shit. Like that would have been, yeah, sure. Let's do another one. So I resigned myself knowing me and knowing you. I knew we were gonna
both
dance
like,
around a little here.
This is interesting. Let's explore it.
It's totally fine. So you had an idea that just triggered for you, and hopefully you still have it.
Okay, I do. So
Okay.
the idea was, I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Soms. I've been wanting to read his book. It's called The Hidden Spring. He's a neuroscientist, and he just wrote a book on the soul. And it's really interesting. I can't get it in Canada yet, unfortunately. So I've been just ravenously consuming his lectures.
Drag. It's available in the US, but not Canada?
Yeah, stupid Canada. But he's from South Africa. He's a neuroscientist from South Africa, and actually is a psychoanalyst as well, which I have my problems with, but we won't get into that because it's not relevant. But his book is really, really interesting because he talks about, and his lectures, just him in general, he talks about something that's always bothered me about consciousness, that coalesced it for me. Like, it's so parsimonious that I couldn't believe I didn't see it before. So, do you know what a nociceptor is?
No.
Okay. So, do you know that you have neurons not just in your brain, but in your body?
Yes, all through your nervous system. Yeah. And that goes through your whole body. And on that note, just because I do know one thing about that,
Okay.
I was amazed to learn at how distributed your neurological functions are throughout your body. And not just centered in your brain. So for instance, when you feel pain and you draw back from it, that's not necessarily because the information goes up to your brain makes a decision, and then it goes back down to your hand. That activity, that reaction is actually happening without ever reaching, like before it reaches the brain, your hand is pulling back.
It kind of does. It reaches your reticular formation,
What's
which
that?
is in your... Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
So nociceptors are they're kind of like pain receptors. They're the type of receptors that you're talking about that are like neurons that are in your body, like in your skin. They're all through your body. So nociceptors are a very specialized type of receptor. They mostly respond to kind of like heat or like acute sort of trauma, like a cut or like a really abrupt sort of sharp hit.
Yeah.
So nociceptors terminate the spinal column, and then they travel up the the signal travels up the spinal column to a place in the back of your brain stem called the reticular formation. Now, this is one thing that's always bothered me when thinking about consciousness, because I think about consciousness all the time because I'm a nerd and a loser, is that the reticular formation terminates like 80% of these signals. One of the reasons that it does is because you would feel your clothes on your skin all day and go insane. Right? Like you would, if your brain didn't make this determination for you, and you're you, right? You're in charge here.
Yeah.
If your brain didn't make that decision without your awareness at all, you would be feeling everything all the time. So it's always kind of hit me weird that this reticular formation is making these decisions.
It's making decisions about what's important and what's not.
He has this theory that we've been looking in the wrong spot for consciousness, because we know that the cortices, like the the part of your brain that has all the gyri that people think of as the brain, but it's actually
is that the
just
spongy
the top
looking
of the brain.
stuff?
It's like the brain's hat.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we think about that as what is us, right? Because that's the part that's doing the thinking and the perceiving theoretically. But what if it's actually the brainstem and the midbrain structures and the things like the reticular formation? Because you can have encephalitis, which is a disorder where you're born essentially with like no brain really, but still demonstrate conscious awareness because you have these like a thalamus, which is a midbrain structure and a brainstem. Like you can still basically kind of move around a little bit and demonstrate emotions.
Yeah, so you're going to be severely limited.
Right. Severely limited,
but there's something going on there.
Right. And
or maybe not
also
here,
there's something going on in lower order animals that also have a brainstem and some of these more ancient brain structures. So and we would perceive them as conscious probably if we're not being really sort of human-centric in our view, if we're not being really anthropomorphic and seeing just us as conscious. So what if that's the seed of consciousness? It's not the part of us that's doing the thinking, it's the part of us that's doing the feeling. So I've been ravenously.
That would theoretically make sense because if you think about the way that we evolved, and if you think about the brain, have you read The Social Leap, William von Hippel?
I have it queued on Audible.
Yeah.
Yes, because you recommended it to me the last time we talked.
Yeah.
Yes, I have it queued on Audible.
Awesome. It's pretty awesome. I think you'll really like it. But it's like thinking about the way that we evolved as creatures and our evolutionary history. The parts of our brain that we seem to have acquired more recently are like, and I hope I'm getting this right, but like the prefrontal cortex and a lot of the upper and forward stuff tends to be the newer stuff. And we had this lower stuff before, right?
Yes.
I'm butchering the terms here. I should be saying things like posterior and something like that.
Brainstem, thalamus, hippocampus, amygdala.
But what's interesting about what you just said is that what you're saying is that like we think about consciousness we have at times thought about consciousness as being like in the sort of newer parts of the brain.
It's like a synonym for intelligent processing to us.
Right. But what you're saying now is like, no. The stuff we've had for a long time, and maybe we are there.
Right. Like we were conscious and emotional creatures.
Before we were super logical
conscious and intelligent creatures. Like the intelligence is an add-on to the consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's given us an awareness of the consciousness that causes us to think that it's a problem that we need to solve. Whereas other creatures don't have that prefrontal part of the brain that's allowed us all of these evolutionary advantages and also this like more diverse sort of robust form of thought and analysis about our environment and ourselves. But we were conscious before that was an ability that we had.
Wow.
And it's just now that we're coming to the realization that consciousness is kind of weird. But we were conscious well before we even had the ability to question the consciousness.
Consciousness is
it
weird. It
seems so parsimonious to me that I can't believe I didn't see it before I heard him talk.
I've had this thought before regarding consciousness, and there's a word for it I learned recently, and I'm going to try to say it, but I know I'll mispronounce it probably. But I remember when I was a kid thinking, I had this thought, and it sort of messed me up for a while.
Oh no! Okay.
And I had this thought like, okay, I know that I am here, and like I'm me, but how do I know that anyone else? How do I know that there's anything in there?
Oh.
Like, how do I know, Like, I know that I'm conscious and the lights are on, and like, if I watch other people, it kind of seems like they are, but like, what if that's all, what if they're not? What if they're just like, what if they're just, what if there's no quote unquote soul in there?
For that, where you're like manifesting
Solipsism.
the word. Yes. Brain in the jar. Yes.
That's the word that I was not sure I was going to pronounce. I said it with confidence, not necessarily accuracy, but solipsism. I may not be saying that right, but it's the idea that like, I can't prove that anybody else is conscious.
Yeah.
I can't though.
I can't.
And
You
so,
really can't.
and so like that, when I was a kid, that thought messed me up for a while. And then
You had that thought when you were a kid?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
To me.
And then I watched the Truman Show.
Oh yeah.
And the Truman Show messed me up again, because I was like, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, except more existentially.
What if I'm a character in a video game? What if I'm in a dome?
Yeah, and then you read about like Descartes and the brain in the vat idea, where it's like like if you feed all the right stimulus into a brain in a vat, it would have the experiences that we're having. Ooh, that leads us to the idea of the simulation.
I love that.
You do?
Okay, so it's
you
interesting.
You talk about it, because I've talked plenty.
So about simulation theory, that we're all I don't think it's tenable, because I think that
I would love for you to break it for me, because it freaks me out.
Well, okay, tell me what freaks you out about it, and then I'll tell you why it doesn't seem tenable to me.
Okay, all right.
What freaks you out?
So this is for the benefit of you guys watching, and we're not just like shooting the shit here and like, well, we are.
We're bad for that. Sorry.
But no, look, I've got some structured episodes, and then I've got these,
and then you have the one where I'm here,
and I'm letting myself be myself. So
right.
So the simulation thing is basically we are creating more and more advanced artificial intelligence all the time, like algorithms that can do amazing things. And the question arose at some point, would we be able to create a simulation that someone could participate in, whether it's VR or like pumped directly into the brain, like Neuralink style? Could we create a simulation that's so convincing that we wouldn't be able to distinguish it from reality? And if the answer to that question is yes, then there's some really weird implications. Because if the answer to the question is yes, that it's possible to basically create an illusion so complete that you couldn't tell it from reality, then we wouldn't be able to know if we were already in that illusion. And if it's theoretically possible for that to be the case, then it's actually mathematically likely that it is the case.
Yeah, I don't see how that would work with proprioception, though.
Oh, is that how you? I've been saying proprioception.
Oh, I could be saying it wrong.
You're the
I'm
psychologist.
from the weird side of Canada, where we say stuff all kinds of weird.
So why don't you? I want to get to proprioception or proprioception.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell me what you think about the simulation theory?
So I think it's cool as a thought experiment. I don't think it's practically tenable at all.
Okay, why is that?
At all. Because I don't think that it would work with your sense of orientation in space, for example, like proprioception, like your ability to understand that you're moving through an environment and have those sensations.
We should define specifically what that is. And this blew my mind too. It's basically like a sixth sense, right?
Yeah, people think there's only 5 senses.
Yeah.
There's actually like perceptually more than that.
Right.
Like wayfinding is a huge, or like being able to understand yourself through space. Like think about, your house, right? You know your house. If your lights are off in your house, you can navigate your way through your house without any other sensory input, really.
Yeah, and how are you doing
for your
that?
Motor memory. It's proprioception.
Exactly.
It's motor memory.
Right. So you don't think
it's
that
your
would
sense
work
of where you are in space.
You don't think that would work in a simulation?
I don't think it would. I think your sense of proprioception, like I don't know how you would
model it.
Right. And a lot of other perceptions too. Like, do you know a lot about visual perception?
No, but
Visual
I know you.
perception is really
I know
interesting.
you're. This is a point of interest for you. So, tell me.
I
Tell
love
me
it.
what you think.
Okay. So everything that we perceive hits our occipital lobe, which is the back of our head, right? It comes through two optic tracts that are just like this at the back of the eye. That's why we have a blind spot, because there's a hole
Right.
in the back of our retina where the optic nerve goes in either eye. And everything we see is upside down, backwards, and full of holes, right? Because anything that's on this side of me is hitting this side of my eye, which is going to this side of my brain. And everything on this side of me is hitting this side of my eye, which is going to this side of my brain, because those optic tracts split in the midbrain right around the thalamus at a point called the optic chiasm.
Okay.
And then feed off to the opposite sides of your brain. Then your brain reconstructs those images based on prior experience.
Oh.
Based on prior experience. So it's referencing memories of previous visual perceptions.
Wait. Let me see if I get this, if I understand.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
fact that I'm blown away probably means that I at least get it a little bit. Is that right? Like, so
I don't know. Tell me, what do you think?
What that says, what you just said says to me that when I see things, when I experience
This is
sight,
gonna mess with you.
Yeah, it's messing with me immediately. When I experience sight, what I am perceiving is not objectively, it's not strictly just a representation of the light hitting my optic nerve.
Oh God, no.
My
God,
brain
no.
is
You know what it is?
constructing the image out of a combination of sensory information and memory. Is that?
That's absolutely right. Like, people think that light hits the back of your eye and that picture transitions to your brain. It doesn't actually. So light,
That's exactly what I thought until just a minute ago.
No, goodness no. So like, you on your retina, you have like a fovea, right? And that's where your cones are. There's
Right.
two different types of receptors in the back of your eye: rods and cones. Rods mostly sense sort of like motion and grayscale, and cones are what gives us color perception. We have 3 types of cones. Birds can have up to 5, by the way. They see more colors than us.
That's badass.
Yeah, but all of those rods and cones, all of this is to say, what we're actually sensing is that there's a photosensitive protein at the end of those rods and cones that reacts in a specific chemical way to a light wavelength hitting it, right?
Right.
So it's not actually sending a picture. It's sending a chemical signal saying, I've augmented my shape as a protein in this way. And that's going to your occipital lobe. And your occipital lobe is saying, all of these proteins in the eye have augmented themselves in this configuration when they've augmented themselves in a similar configuration in the past. What did we experience around us? Did we touch something? Was it hot? Was it cold? Did we like it? Was it bright? Did it have colors? Did we approach it? Did we go away from it? And all of that happens in such a blink of an eye. Your brain makes and it's all upside down too, because your eyes are convex. And there's a vitreous and aqueous humor. Like your eyes are filled with jelly, right?
Yeah.
That jelly has little floaties in it. And there's a hole in the middle of it. So everything you see is literally upside down, backwards, full of holes, then splits off in 2 different directions, goes to the back of your head, and then just gets constructed by memory. Now, the reason I bring this up is not to freak you out, though it should freak people out.
No, it does. It completely freaks me out because I'm thinking about all the implications.
Whole cloth, an environment that has that perceptual quality that would allow it to be consistent enough that your brain would know how to interpret it as something like reality from a perceptual standpoint.
Yes.
What would the point of reference be?
Okay, so you just fixed one of my problems and gave me a new one.
You're welcome.
Okay, that actually makes
What's the new one?
Well, that makes a ton of sense as far as the simulation theory is concerned. So like,
Okay.
very nice. That's off the table. I'm probably living in base reality. How lovely for me.
You exist in the universe, John.
Yeah, I think I exist. I actually.
You are not in the Matrix.
I'm slightly more confident that I exist now than I was 5 minutes ago, which is really. This day was a win.
Awesome.
But
any day I don't find yogurt on something weird in my house, I declare.
Oh, there's no days I don't find yogurt. Kids.
Really?
So, no, but here's the thing
What's the new one, though?
that you just gave me that actually is going to mess me up now. Which every time we talk, something messes me up. Not in a bad way, in like a ooh, this is really interesting. I've never thought about this kind of way. What you just told me basically indicates to me that like what we experience as sight is a combination of stimulus, but also memory, and basically computational photography is a way to think about it. So, here's why I'm using that term. So I do film work, and when I do film work, I use cameras, and cameras have sensors, and they create an image, right? Well, the nicer cameras tend to have a larger sensor. It collects more light. You can get a richer image. Cell phones are limited in how big the lens can be and how big the sensor can be, just because of the physical size of the phone. And so cell phone makers, as they've been trying to make more better cameras for smartphones, they've had to do something other than make the sensor bigger and other than make the lens bigger. They can't collect more light because there's just not physical room enough. One of my clients is a tech company. I'm probably letting on now. I can't say who, but that's where I'm learning all this stuff. So what they do is they instead employ a technique called computational photography. So what they're doing is they're basically, the phone takes a photo, sometimes multiple photos, sometimes many multiple photos very rapidly, and then it compares them, and it analyzes the information and figures out like, hey, what is this? Is this a person? Is this a chair? Is this, it uses AI to try and figure out what the objects in this low quality image are.
Now imagine it did that and it also recognized voices.
This is where I'm going.
Locations.
Right.
And context.
Yes. So this is why I say it's messing me up, because what a cell phone does is it basically takes some stimulus and compares it with what it knows, and then it generates an image. So what you just told me about the brain is that basically the brain works the same way, right?
Only with way more information.
A ton of information. Well, then I took what you just said about sight, and my next question is that how we process all our senses?
Yes. Why do you think hallucinations exist?
Well, not just hallucinations, but okay, so then misperceptions, but also like
you can recreate whole ass memories
that aren't
never happened.
Yeah, that never happened. And that's actually well documented.
Oh yeah, look up Elizabeth Loftus. Very well.
Elizabeth Loftus. Okay.
You will love Elizabeth Loftus, or you'll hate me for telling you about her.
But here's the crux of...
Probably the latter.
Yeah, here's the crux of why this is a big deal for me. Because it's like, I spend a lot of time thinking, I talk to so-and-so, such and such a person. They're very smart, but they believe some things that are really different than what I believe, Or this person over here, they believe things completely differently, and they're also very smart. And so I'm sometimes vexed by that question of like, how is it that so many very, very smart people have such different opinions and views and beliefs on things? And what you just laid out for me is maybe part of the answer, is that the way that we're experiencing the world is not objective. It's based on a continuing evolution of the things that we hold internally to compare our stimuli to. And and if
and future projections also incorporate future projections in that.
Right. Tell me about that.
Most of what our brains do is project future scenarios.
Right. And there would be an
We're
evolutionary
predicting.
benefit to that because we'd be able to, we'd be more likely to survive if we can predict future threats.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to spend some time thinking about this. So I've had the thought, like, it does seem like me and so are living in like a different world. And in a sensory perception way, the way that we see the world is very predicated upon the way that we have experienced. Okay, but the way that we experience the world is very much predicated upon how we have experienced the world in the past. And we all haven't necessarily experienced the world in the same way.
Yes.
That seems like a big deal.
Yeah. That's why personally, I agree. That's why I really wish more people took neuroscience, psychology, and perception seriously. People think of perception and they think of just the stuff you touch, taste, smell, just your olfactory, your taste, your vision. They think it's just passive receipt of external stimuli. They don't realize that all of that mixes up and incorporates into who you are and is influenced by who you are, where you are, what your context is, how you've been raised, what you're exposed to, what you're not exposed to, what you're anticipating in the future, how you've been primed. Like, have you haven't heard of Elizabeth Loftus, so you'll like this.
Okay, tell me.
This one's gonna mess with you. I'm gonna mess with you again. Can I mess with you
please.
one more time?
I like it.
Okay. So, if I show you and one other person the exact same video, like you're sequestered, separate from each other. I show both of you the exact same video of a car accident, right? So there's a car, like the exact same video, two cars hit each other. Now, if I go to you and I say, how fast was that car going when it smashed into the other car? And I go to the other person and I say, how fast was that car going when it bumped into the other car? And based on the tone of voice that I use and the type of language that I use, both of you are going to tell me very different speeds. The person that I say, how fast was that car going when it nudged the other car, when it bumped it? They might say, I don't know, like 50. And if I say to you, when that car flew out of nowhere and smashed into that car, how fast do you think it was going? You might say 80.
So you're
You
talking
both
about
just watched and experienced the
suggestibility.
exact same thing. But the context of me priming you to recall that information changed the perception.
Yeah.
Changed the perception so that you now experience that through a lens that I've created for you. It's messed up. More people should. It is a big goddamn deal.
Yeah. Well, I've thought some about how suggestible we are as human beings, and the answer is a lot. It's hard for me in my frame of mind to hear that and not think about religious services.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Like
no,
because you
no.
feel that they're very primed environments for priming.
Oh, they absolutely are they not? Like, of course.
Well,
they
I mean,
are.
yeah, I agree with you. I was asking you how you felt about it instead of I didn't want to prime you.
No. It's
yeah.
I feel like what you're getting
Especially
at
with the music.
is a psychological. Yeah. I mean, I did Christian music for 15 years, so I was just running around priming people.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm taking away from this conversation is that consciousness and the mind and the brain is super layered and complex, and what we think of as the experience of being ourselves is not as simple as maybe as it feels like when we're just springing out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, well, being ourselves is effortless on a day-to-day basis. Like we managed to do it with just by existing.
Yeah.
But I think that if we want to do it best, it takes a bit more effort than that. And one of the best things that you can do is work to understand who you are. And a lot of people, I think, acknowledge that. And they think that turning to something like a religion is what's going to be the answer. That's going to help them understand who they are. When really understanding physically who you are, it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
Like, actually learning about how I process and act and relate to information and why helped me so much more on the journey towards being the best version of myself than looking outside of myself for someone to give me answers to it ever, I think, would have.
That's awesome. That's good. I don't know a better way to wrap this up than what you just said. That's really good. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I love our semi-organized, semi-erratic exchanges. It's really a blast. And so, where can people find out more about you and check you out? I mean, obviously, you're very present on YouTube, but where can people go to learn more about you?
You could follow me on Twitter if you want. I don't know if I'd recommend it if you want to.
Well, I mean, we're gonna now, right?
Wasteland.
Yeah.
But yeah, probably my YouTube channel. It's just called Shannon Q.
Yeah,
I have
not hard
a lot
to find.
of.
It'll be linked.
It's easy.
Yeah, it'll be linked in the show notes and the YouTube description. Yeah. So go check out Shannon and you know, are you still doing the Atheist Experience regularly right now, or?
Once a month. Yeah,
once a month.
I'm doing it once a month, and I do the line probably about the same, about once a month. Both of those are call-in shows. So if something I said here has frustrated you and you feel like you just need to tell me about why I'm wrong, you can literally call me.
Yeah.
And talk to me about it.
Yeah.
I host 2 call-in shows. I'm very open to dialogue.
That's awesome. And the Atheist Experience is usually on Sundays, is that right?
Yeah.
And the call-in is when?
I'm thinking time zones because I live in Narnia. I'm in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
So like I have a time zone no one else recognizes the existence of. It's 6:30 p.m. here, which I think is 5:30 p.m. Eastern.
Oh, is that also
time.
on a Sunday typically?
On Sundays.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Shannon, thank you so much. And thanks for blowing my mind and messing me up.
No, thank you for talking to me. I love talking to you. I have the best conversations with you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm humbled and glad that I could be here and hope that I contributed something.
Oh, you did. And there goes my camera. Perfect timing. Okay, that was my conversation with Shannon Q. Thank you guys so much for watching and for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And go and check out Shannon's YouTube channel. That is linked in the show notes if you're listening to the podcast, and it's linked in the YouTube description if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you guys so much. I hope to see you next week. And until then, stay curious.